The year was 1875, and the United States was in the midst of transformation. Cities were rising, railroads were stretching farther into the wilderness, and the hunger for timber was insatiable. Wood-built homes, rail ties, bridges, and barns, it fueled fires and became the backbone of progress. For many laboring men, timber was more than wood, it was opportunity. When word spread through taverns and church halls of a new contract from a wealthy timber company, men listened. The company claimed it had discovered an untouched stretch of forest, hundreds of miles wide, with pines and oaks that reached higher than church steeples. The offer was simply strong men willing to cut whole and live rough in the wilderness would be paid handsomely, enough to feed their families for a year, maybe more. For men who often worked day to day just to put bread on the table, such an offer was golden. It meant shoes for their children, medicines for their sick wives, and perhaps a chance to finally escape the crushing weight of poverty. Some saw it as the doorway to a better life, others as the chance to prove themselves in a world that had little patience for weakness. Within weeks, 121 men answered the call. They came from different walks of life. Immigrants from Ireland, Germany, and Scandinavia, farmhands who had lost crops to drought, veterans of the Civil War who had never found steady footing afterward. Though they were strangers to one another, they were bound by the same hunger for survival and hope for something greater. The company wasted no time. The men were gathered in a small riverside town, issued tools, basic supplies, and instructions. To many, the sight of freshly sharpened axes and long saws glistening in the sun was the sight of hope itself. They were told the forest lay far north, beyond established towns, beyond mapped roads where no rail yet reached. It would be a difficult journey, the foreman warned, but the reward would be worth it. Spirits were high as the men prepared to leave. Wives hugged their husbands tightly, children clutched their fathers' legs, and promises were whispered through tears. "I'll be back with enough money to buy us land. Don't worry, this job will change everything." The caravan that set out in late spring was a sight to behold. Wagons creaked under the weight of tools and tents. Mules strained against their loads, and the men marched with determination. Songs were sung along the trail, stories were traded, and laughter echoed as though hardship was a distant stranger. Hope has a way of making burdens light. As they marched deeper into wilderness, the landscape began to change. Roads gave way to dirt paths to narrow trails, until only the thick forest stood before them. Towering trees rose like giants, their canopies blotting out the sky. The air smelled of pine and damp earth, a mix that was both invigorating and intimidating. When they arrived at the chosen site, a clearing near a river, the men looked around with awe. Here was wealth waiting to be taken, endless acres of wood, water to float logs downstream, and rich soil to build a camp upon. Some of the younger men shouted with excitement, already dreaming of the wages in their pockets. The first days were filled with energy. Together they cleared space for cabins, built makeshift shelters, and set up a cookhouse. Blisters and sore muscles mattered little when compared to the promise of the future. There was camaraderie in every swing of the axe. Every log carried shoulder to shoulder. They called it the Champ of Fortune, a name spoken with pride as though destiny itself had guided them there. At night, fires crackled as men sat around in circles, eating salted pork or beans, telling tales of the homes they had left behind. Some spoke of wives waiting patiently, some of children they prayed to see grow up strong. A few dreamed aloud of returning as landowners, never to swing an axe for another man again. In those first weeks, the promise of riches felt real. The forest seemed no match for 121 determined men, and though the work was backbreaking, hope dulled the pain. The timber company's foreman occasionally visited, nodding approvingly at their progress, promising that wagons of food and medicine would arrive regularly. And the men believed him. Why wouldn't they? The company had money, they had strength, and the forest had trees enough to fill 1,000 lifetimes. It felt like a fair trade, labor for wealth, sweat for security. But beneath the glow of promise, cracks were already beginning to form. Some men noticed that supplies seemed lighter than expected. A few whispered that the company cared more for profit than people. Others brushed off such doubts, insisting they had no reason to worry. After all, weren't they working for their families, for the hope of a better tomorrow? As the sun set on the camp each evening, the forest seemed to close in tighter, its shadows stretching long and dark. The men laughed and sang louder then, as though to chase away the unease. The forest was vast, yes, but they were many. They were strong. They were united. Little did they know, the promise of riches that had led them here was not the blessing they thought it to be. For in that same forest where they saw opportunity, hardship lay waiting. Hardship that would test not just their bodies, but their spirits, their loyalties, and their very will to live. But in the spring of 1875, none of that was yet clear. All they saw was the gold of opportunity shining just ahead, a future they believed they could seize with calloused hands and determined hearts. And so, with dreams brighter than the morning sun, 121 men stepped into the unknown, believing riches awaited them. The men had arrived at the clearing by the river with their spirits still high. After weeks of travel through mud, swollen streams, and dense trees, the sight of a wide open space felt like relief. It wasn't much. A patch of land carved out by nature itself, circled by towering pines and maples. But to the 121 loggers, it was the beginning of something that felt bigger than themselves. The first order of business was survival. A forest as wild as this offered no comfort unless men wrestled it into shape. The company had provided them with the most basic of supplies: axes, saws, nails, canvas, and some sacks of flour, beans, pork, and dried fruit. But it was up to the men to transform the raw wilderness into a livable camp. Work began the very next morning. They felled trees not just for timber, but for shelter. Rough cabins rose quickly, nothing more than log walls sealed with mud, but they kept out the wind and gave the illusion of permanence. A cookhouse was erected near the river, its chimney sending up the first signs of smoke into the untouched sky. The men worked with a vigor that came only from necessity. Hunger and exhaustion could wait, shelter could not. They built a bunkhouse for the single men, small family shacks for the few who had brought kin, and a large shed to store tools and cut logs. By the end of the first week, what had been wild forest looked like a settlement. They were proud. Around evening fires, men laughed about how quickly they had bent the wilderness to their will. Some compared themselves to pioneers, carving order out of chaos. They named the place Camp Prosper, a name that rolled easily off their tongues and reminded them of the fortune they had come seeking. At first, life in the camp had rhythm. At dawn, the cook rang an iron triangle to wake them, and they ate quickly. Biscuits if they were lucky, porridge if supplies were running thin. Then, from sunrise to sunset, the forest shook with the sounds of labor. Axes struck, saws screeched, and the groan of falling trees echoed like thunder. Men shouted to one another as they dragged logs to the riverbank, where rafts would eventually carry them downstream to markets and mills. The work was brutal, but it was also honest. Sweat ran down their backs, calluses thickened on their hands, and at night they fell into their bunks too tired to dream. But many felt a deep sense of purpose. This was not idle toil. Every tree felled, every log stacked was money. Money they believed would change their lives when they returned home. Yet the wilderness did not make it easy. The forest was not an enemy, but it was no friend either. Its silence was heavy, broken only by the crack of branches and the distant cry of animals. Sometimes, men swore they heard things moving beyond the lantern light at night, shapes darting between trees, strange calls that didn't sound like wolves or owls. Some laughed off the tales, calling them tricks of tired minds. Others, especially the older loggers, grew uneasy, muttering that forests as old as this kept secrets men were never meant to disturb. Still they pressed on. As summer turned into fall, the cracks in camp life began to show. Supplies from the company came less frequently than promised. Flour dwindled, pork grew rancid, and beans were stretched into thin stews that barely satisfied. Hunting helped for a time, but game was not always plentiful, and men argued over who got more than their share. Illness struck soon after. Nothing deadly at first. Coughs, fevers, infections from axe wounds. But in the wilderness, without proper medicine, even a small wound could turn grave. The camp's foreman tried to keep morale high, promising more shipments, promising that winter would not hit as hard as the rumors suggested. But promises were thin comfort to men who went to bed hungry, and then there was the loneliness. For men used to towns and villages, the isolation gnawed at them. Letters home traveled slowly, and answers came slower still. Some men stared into the fire at night, whispering their wives' names under their breath, their eyes glassy with longing. Others grew restless, walking the edge of camp as if searching for something to fill the emptiness. Arguments broke out. Over food, over tools, over who worked harder and who shirked his duties. Unity, once strong when they first entered the forest, began to fray at the edges. But not everything was bleak. There were nights when laughter filled the camp, when men gathered to sing songs from their homelands, when a fiddle played by a German logger turned the clearing into a dance hall. On such nights, even the darkest forest seemed less threatening. They were reminders that though they were far from home, they were not entirely alone. Still, beneath the songs and fires, unease continued to grow. The men began to notice how quickly time passed, how supplies seemed to vanish, and how the company's foreman visited less and less. The promise of riches that had once burned so brightly now flickered like a lantern in the wind. One evening, as the autumn air turned sharp, the men gathered around the fire. A logger named James, broad-shouldered and respected, stood and spoke plainly. "We came here for riches," he said, his voice steady, "but the forest takes more than it gives. If we don't stand together, we'll not see the spring." His words struck deep. Some nodded, some looked away, but all understood the truth. The wilderness did not care for their dreams, and the company that had sent them might not care much either. Their survival would depend not on promises, but on each other. That night, for the first time, silence fell heavy over the camp. The men sat in thought, staring into the fire, listening to the endless whisper of the trees. The wilderness had accepted their presence, but at a cost none of them yet fully understood. The camp had been built. The work had begun, but already the forest was testing them, and the hardest trials were still to come. By the time the leaves began to fall in late autumn, the once hopeful settlement of Camp Prosper was already strained. What had begun with laughter and determination was slowly shifting into quiet unease. The forest had seemed endless in its bounty, but now its challenges showed teeth. The first problem was food. The shipments from the company had slowed to a trickle. Promises of wagons laden with flour, salted meats, and dried fruit were replaced with excuses delivered by the foreman. Floods had delayed the wagons, or supplies were short in town. Each excuse wore thinner than the last. By November, what little remained of the company rations had been stretched past breaking. Meals grew smaller. At first, the cook watered down the beans, stretching one pot to feed 20 men. Then came days when there was nothing but a heel of bread and a weak broth made from bark boiled in river water. The men grumbled, but they endured, at least for a time. Hunger, however, is a patient but relentless adversary. Hunting parties set out each dawn, hoping to bring back deer, rabbits, or anything that could fill empty stomachs. Sometimes they returned with meat that lifted spirits for a night, but often they came back empty-handed. As the cold deepened, game grew scarce, as though the animals had fled before winter's grip. Traps yielded little more than lean squirrels. The men's bodies, once hardened by labor, began to wither. Cheeks hollowed, belts tightened, and hands shook from weakness. Hunger bred suspicion. It was whispered that some hoarded scraps. Men began watching each other during meals, counting every bite their companions took. When a barrel of pork went missing, accusations flew like sparks from the fire. One man was beaten after being found hiding a strip of dried meat beneath his bunk. Whether guilt or desperation drove him, no one cared. The bond of trust that had once united the 121 was cracking. Division did not arrive in an explosion, but rather seeped in like cold air through the gaps of a cabin wall. Factions began to form. Some believed they should abandon the camp and try to march back to civilization before winter grew worse. Others argued survival lay only in staying, in finishing the work, and trusting the company would eventually deliver what was owed. A third group withdrew altogether, speaking little, hoarding what strength they had left for themselves. Around the fire at night, debates turned into arguments. Men shouted, fists flew, and friendships built over months dissolved in minutes. The sound of laughter, once common in Camp Prosper, became rare. Yet not all hope was lost. There were men who still tried to hold the camp together. James, the broad-shouldered logger who had spoken earlier about unity, continued to gather men around the fire. He reminded them of their families waiting at home, of the wages they still hoped to collect, of the lives worth fighting for. "Hunger will pass," he said one bitter night, as the men huddled in furs and thin blankets. "But if we turn on each other, we'll have nothing left when it does. Remember why we came here. Remember who we came for." For a moment, his words rekindled something, a spark of the old brotherhood. Men nodded, and for a night, the camp seemed steadier. But hunger has a way of drowning noble words. By December, the snow began to fall heavy and unyielding. The forest, once alive with green, now stood in skeletal silence, its trees burdened with white. Hunting became nearly impossible. The river froze, cutting off even the small fish they had once caught. The men, already gaunt, grew desperate. Some chewed leather straps to quiet the gnawing in their stomachs. Others spoke in whispers of raiding each other's cabins at night. A dark cloud settled over the camp, not just of hunger but of mistrust. Every creak of a door, every rustle in the dark was met with suspicion. It was during these weeks that the first deserters made their choice. A group of 5 men packed what little they had, an axe, some blankets, and a pouch of flour, and announced they were leaving. "We'll starve if we stay," one said. "Better to risk the forest than rot here waiting for promises that won't come." Their departure was met with mixed feelings. Some envied their courage, others cursed their foolishness. The 9 who survived would later recall those men never returned. Whether they froze in the woods, drowned in the river, or simply vanished into the snow, no one ever knew. Inside the camp, the fractures widened. The cookhouse became a battlefield. Every meal was an argument: who got more, who got less, who deserved nothing at all. More than once, knives were drawn. Only the presence of men like James and a few others kept blood from spilling. Still, amid the chaos, moments of humanity lingered. A logger named Samuel shared the last of his bread with a sick companion, whispering, "He's got a family same as me." Another carved small toys from wood scraps to keep morale from sinking too deep. These gestures, though small, reminded the men that even in hunger, compassion could survive. But as the year turned and the forest grew harsher, the truth became undeniable. Hunger had become not just an enemy, but a weapon. It gnawed at their bodies, clouded their minds, and divided their spirits. Where once they had been 121 strong, united in a single purpose, now they were a camp splintered, fragile, and teetering on the edge of collapse. The forest had not defeated them with beasts or storms, but with something far more powerful: emptiness. And in that emptiness, division had taken root. The men still worked when they could, still swung axes at the trees, but the sound was weaker now, the rhythm broken. Each swing seemed more a plea for survival than an act of labor. Every fallen tree was less a promise of wages and more a reminder of their dwindling strength. The forest, patient and vast, waited in silence. The men of Camp Prosper, once so proud, were learning a lesson harsher than any foreman could deliver. In hunger, a man must choose between selfishness and solidarity, and in those choices lay the difference between life and death. Winter had tightened its grip by January. The forest that had once echoed with the crack of axes now lay buried under snow so deep that men sometimes sank to their knees, just stepping outside their cabins. The cold was merciless, biting through wool and furs, creeping into every corner of Camp Prosper. But the greatest threat was not the chill. It was what the cold carried with it: disease. The men were already weak from hunger, their bodies thinned and defenses lowered. It began with coughs, dry, hacking sounds that echoed in the bunkhouse at night. At first, no one paid it much attention. A cough was nothing unusual in the cold. But soon the coughs turned into fevers. Men shivered even as their skin burned with heat, eyes glassy and unfocused. Then came the infections: a small cut from an axe, a blister rubbed raw by rope. Wounds that would have healed easily in better times now festered. Without medicine, even the simplest injury became a doorway for sickness. One man sliced his palm on a saw blade. Within a week, the wound had swollen, red streaks creeping up his arm. He died with his hand blackened. the stench of rot lingering in the cabin long after his body was carried out. Burials became a grim ritual. At first, they dug proper graves near the edge of the forest, marking them with simple wooden crosses. But as the ground froze harder, it became nearly impossible to break through the earth. Some bodies were buried shallow, others left under cairns of stone. The men performed the rites in silence, breath clouding in the icy air, their faces gaunt with grief. Hope, already stretched thin by hunger, began to vanish altogether. Despair crept into the camp as steadily as the disease itself. The once busy evenings around the fire grew quiet. Men no longer told stories of home or sang songs. They sat in silence, eyes downcast, the crackling fire their only voice. The sickness spared no one. Even the strongest loggers found themselves brought low. James, the man who had once held the group together with his speeches of unity, fell ill with fever. For days, the men tended to him, placing wet cloths on his brow, spooning what little broth they had into his mouth. His survival became a kind of symbol. If James could endure, maybe the rest could too. But disease did not respect symbols. After 2 weeks of suffering, James breathed his last, his chest rattling one final time before going still. His death was a blow that shook the entire camp. If a man as strong and hopeful as James could fall, what chance did the rest of them have? Fear turned inward. Men began avoiding one another, afraid that even sharing the same air would bring sickness. The bunkhouse, once filled with camaraderie, grew tense and quiet. Some isolated themselves in their cabins, refusing to come out except when necessary. Others muttered that the camp was cursed, that the forest itself had turned against them. There were those who tried to fight the despair. Samuel, the logger who had shared his bread with the sick, became a caretaker of sorts. He moved from cabin to cabin, tending to the weak, wrapping wounds, whispering prayers over the dying. His hands were cracked and bleeding from the cold, but he pressed on, insisting that kindness was as important as food. Yet even Samuel could not stop the tide. By February, more than 30 men had succumbed to disease. The air in the camp was filled with the smell of smoke, sickness, and sorrow. Despair began to twist men's minds. Some stopped working altogether, sitting by the river for hours, staring at the ice, as if waiting for it to crack open and swallow them. Others talked of giving up, lying down and letting the snow cover them, ending the suffering. A few turned to drink, raiding the last barrels of whiskey meant for trade, numbing themselves until they could not feel the cold or hunger. The foreman, once so confident, grew silent. He had no answers, no reassurances left to give. The company was nowhere to be seen, and with each death, the men's resentment grew. What had once been murmurs of discontent now became bitter declarations. We were sent here to die. The company has abandoned us. We're nothing but bodies to them. Still, even in despair, flickers of resilience remained. A small group of men banded together to care for the sick, pooling their rations to keep the weakest alive. They made poultices from pine sap, brewed teas from bark and herbs, anything to ease suffering. Sometimes it worked, often it did not, but their refusal to surrender entirely reminded others that not all hope was gone. One night, as the wind howled outside and snow piled against the cabin doors, Samuel gathered the men who were still able to stand. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "We cannot let this camp be only graves and ghosts," he said. "If we despair, the forest has already beaten us. If we hold to each other, even now, we have a chance. We must endure for ourselves, for those who lie buried, for the ones waiting at home." His words did not bring cheer, but they planted something fragile: determination. The men nodded, weary but unwilling to let despair take the last of their strength. Still, the truth was unavoidable. Disease had cut them down as surely as any axe could fell a tree. Where once 121 men had entered the forest with hope in their eyes, the camp now echoed with coughs, cries, and the silence of the dead. The wilderness had revealed its cruelty in full, and the men of Camp Prosper learned the hardest truth of all. The fight was no longer for riches, it was for survival itself. By the time the first signs of spring began to soften the snow, Camp Prosper was a shadow of what it had once been. The tally of men had dwindled shockingly from the proud company of 121. Only a fraction remained. Many had succumbed to disease, hunger, or the cold. Others had vanished into the forest, desperate enough to gamble on escape, their fates swallowed by the wilderness. In the end, only 9 remained. They were not the 9 anyone might have predicted. They were not the strongest men who had boasted of their endurance, nor the loudest voices who had once rallied the camp. Instead, they were an unlikely collection of the steadfast, the stubborn, and the quietly determined. There was Samuel, the caretaker, whose selflessness had carried others through dark nights. There was Elias, a wiry Scandinavian logger who had shared every morsel of food he found, no matter how small. John, an older veteran of the Civil War, carried scars both seen and unseen, but also a discipline that kept his mind sharp when others faltered. Beside them stood 6 others, men with no special claim to strength, but bound together by one thing: they refused to give up on one another. What set these 9 apart was not their muscle or skill with an axe, but their commitment to unity. They had made an unspoken pact: whatever they had, they would share. If one found food, it was divided into 9 parts. If one fell ill, the others tended him, even at the risk of catching sickness themselves. When exhaustion tempted them to collapse, they leaned on each other, sometimes literally, to keep moving. It was this bond that saved them. While others hoarded, fought, or abandoned their fellows, the 9 clung to solidarity. Hunger gnawed at their stomachs just the same, and despair whispered at their ears. But they answered it with loyalty. In the bleakest nights, when the fire burned low and death seemed only a breath away, they reminded each other of the reasons to hold on. Wives, children, parents waiting far away. As winter loosened its grip, the 9 faced a decision: remain in the cursed camp and hope for salvation that would likely never come, or risk everything on the long march back to civilization. The choice was clear. Camp Prosper was no longer a home, only a graveyard. If they stayed, they would join the dead. So they prepared for the journey. Their supplies were pitiful: 2 sacks of flour, a little dried meat, and what scraps they could scavenge. They fashioned makeshift packs from bark and cloth, filled canteens from the thawing river, and carved sturdy walking sticks. Before leaving, they stood silently among the graves of their comrades, heads bowed. "We walk for them too," Samuel whispered. The others nodded. Then, with nothing but determination in their hearts, they set out. The forest was still treacherous. Snow lingered in drifts, rivers ran high with meltwater, and the ground was thick with mud. But the 9 pressed forward together, taking turns at the front to break the trail, never allowing one man to carry the burden for long. When one stumbled, the others lifted him. When one grew weak, another gave him a portion of his own food. Days bled into nights. They slept huddled together for warmth, often with little more than embers to guard against the cold. Hunger was a constant shadow. Their rations dwindled quickly, and they survived on what little they could forage: roots, early shoots, the occasional bird caught in a snare. Still, they moved forward, step by grueling step. It was not just the wilderness that threatened them, it was despair itself. More than once, one of the 9 faltered, saying they could go no further. In those moments, the others gathered around, speaking words of encouragement, lifting their spirits as surely as they lifted their bodies. "You're not walking alone," John would say, his weathered voice steady. "Not one of us is alone." That promise carried them further than food ever could. On the 12th day of their march, they reached the edge of the forest. Beyond the trees lay the faint outline of farmland, civilization. Exhausted, starving, and ragged, the 9 stumbled into a small settlement, their appearance so gaunt that villagers at first mistook them for phantoms. When the truth became known, the townsfolk rushed to their aid. Blankets, bread, and broth were given freely. Tears rolled down their cheeks as they realized they had escaped what so many others had not. The nightmare of Camp Prosper was behind them at last. The story of their survival spread quickly. The company that had sent them into the wilderness tried to bury the truth, ashamed of the disaster and its own negligence. But the tale could not be silenced. People spoke not just of the tragedy, but of the miracle, the 9 who endured when over 100 had perished. For the survivors themselves, the memory of those months never left. They bore the scars in their bodies, their dreams and their souls. Yet they also carried something else, proof of the strength found in unity. They knew they had survived not because of luck, nor because they were stronger than the others, but because they had held together when everything else fell apart. Years later, when Samuel told the story to his grandchildren, he always ended the same way. We were not the strongest men, nor the cleverest. We were simply the ones who refused to let go of each other. Alone, we would have died. Together, we endured. That was their legacy. Out of 121, only 9 walked out, but they carried with them a lesson worth more than any riches the company had promised. When the world turns cold and dark, survival belongs to those who stand together. When the 9 men stumbled out of the forest that spring of 1876, the world beyond Camp Prosper barely knew what they had endured. To the villagers who first sheltered them, they looked like the living dead. Faces hollow, eyes sunken, clothes tattered, and bodies so thin they seemed made of bone. They were fed broth slowly, for fear their stomachs could not handle real food, and wrapped in warm blankets until their shivering ceased. For days, they said little. Exhaustion was heavier than words. But as their strength returned, so too did their voices, and soon the story began to spread. It was not a tale of riches as the company had promised. It was a tale of betrayal, hunger, disease, and despair. Most of all, it was a tale of unity, how out of 121 men, only 9 had walked out, not because they were stronger, but because they had held to one another when all else was lost. The timber company, upon hearing of their survival, reacted not with compassion but with fear. Officials feared scandal, feared the loss of contracts, feared lawsuits from families of the dead. They tried to silence the story. Records were hidden, wages denied, and blame shifted onto the men themselves. The company claimed they had not worked hard enough, that they had abandoned their duties. But the truth could not be buried. The villagers who had saved the 9 spoke openly of what they had heard. Letters were written, newspapers began to ask questions, and whispers turned to outrage. Still, in the years that followed, the official story faded, and Camp Prosper slipped into obscurity. The graves of more than 100 men lay unmarked, swallowed by moss and roots, their names known only to loved ones who never saw them return. And yet, though history tried to forget them, the survivors never forgot. Each of the 9 returned to their homes, to families who had wept through winter nights thinking them dead. Their arrivals were bittersweet. Joy for survival mingled with grief for the many who had not returned. Wives listened in silence as their husbands spoke of hunger so sharp it bent the mind, of sickness that stole men in the night, of friends buried beneath snow. Children, too young to understand, clung to fathers they barely recognized, promising never to let go again. For Samuel, the caretaker, life after the forest became a mission. He traveled between towns, sharing the story of Camp Prosper, not as a tragedy alone, but as a lesson. He told of the 9, of how unity had been their salvation, of how selfishness and division had killed far more men than the cold or hunger. His words carried weight, because they were not polished speeches, but truths carved into him by suffering. The forest, he would say, his voice slow and steady, taught us something no coin ever could. Alone, a man will break. Together, men can endure what should be impossible. Elias, the quiet Scandinavian, chose another path. He returned to farming, living simply, but every harvest he set aside a portion for widows and orphans of the lost loggers. He rarely spoke of Camp Prosper, but his deeds spoke louder than any words. John, the old veteran, wrote down his memories in a weathered journal, determined that one day his grandchildren would read them and understand what it meant to hold fast in the face of despair. The lesson they carried was not just about survival in the forest. It was about life itself. In every village and town, men and women faced their own wildernesses. Poverty, loss, sickness, hardship. The story of the 9 reminded them that the way through such darkness was not by standing alone, but by holding fast to one another. Years passed. The timber company collapsed, swallowed by larger corporations. Camp Prosper rotted away, its cabins falling into ruin, reclaimed by trees. The graves vanished beneath moss and soil, unmarked and unremembered. To most, the place was nothing but forest once more. But in kitchens and meeting halls, around fires and in church pews, the story lived on. The 9 had not survived to become wealthy. They returned with no gold, no land, no fortune promised by the company. Yet they had gained something rarer, the knowledge that human endurance is not built from muscle or wealth, but from compassion, loyalty, and unity. This was the forgotten lesson, the truth hidden beneath the tragedy. It was not about the 112 men who perished, though their loss was heavy. It was about the 9 who walked out, carrying on their shoulders the burden of remembrance and the gift of wisdom. Generations later, their descendants would tell the tale again, though often in fragments, how their grandfather or great-grandfather had survived a logging camp where almost all others had died. Children listened wide-eyed, not realizing they were hearing echoes of one of the hardest winters in history. The graves of Camp Prosper remain lost, but the lesson endures when life becomes a wilderness. Survival depends not on standing alone, but on standing together. For those who hear the story today, it is a reminder that hardship is not confined to forests of the 1800s. Hunger, despair, and fear still creep into lives in different forms. Bills unpaid, sickness in the family, dreams dashed by failure. The world is still full of winters, though they wear different faces. And still the answer remains the same: unity, resilience, hope. The forest claimed 112 lives, but it could not claim the spirit of the 9 who endured. That spirit, though history tried to bury it, remains alive for anyone who faces their own dark season. As Samuel once told his grandchildren before he passed, "Do not remember us for what we lost. Remember us for what we refused to surrender, our faith in one another." That, children, is the only fortune worth seeking.